Okay, so in commercial real estate, there's like one number everyone really obsesses over, right? It's like um, this key metric that kind of dictates the health of any deal.
Yeah, lenders are all over it. And, savvy investors use it to really kind of um, strategically position themselves.
Totally. It's DSCR, debt service coverage ratio, basically like the financial heartbeat of a property.
Yeah.
And, today, this deep dive, that's exactly what we're doing. We're
Right.
getting into DSCR, whether you're like a pro or, just starting out with commercial real estate.
Yeah.
It's going to be good stuff.
Yeah, we're going deep on DSCR, for excellence in commercial real estate, right? So, our insights today are coming from a guide by Cara Conde.
Yeah.
She's like a super experienced commercial real estate agent right here in the Indianapolis market.
Yeah.
So you're getting like, boots on the ground knowledge from someone in the trenches.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And our goal isn't just to like define DSCR.
Yeah.
We want you to really grasp how it works, how to, use it to assess risk, and then how to really kind of optimize your commercial property investments.
Right.
So we're going to break it down into clear, actionable steps.
Yeah.
Drawing on Cara Conde's expertise and really focusing on those real-world examples that apply specifically to, the Indianapolis area.
Yeah, so like what are we going to actually kind of unpack from Cara Conde's guide?
Yeah.
Well, we'll start with the, core concept of what DSCR is.
Okay.
Then we'll get into, the specifics of calculating it, and then really understanding what those numbers are telling us.
Right.
Like, what's the story? Then we'll also look at, how crucial DSCR is, throughout, like, the decision-making process in commercial real estate.
Okay.
Then we'll get into effective strategies for, boosting your DSCR. And then finally, we'll address some of the frequently asked questions about, the super important metric.
Perfect. So let's just jump right in.
Yeah.
What is DSCR? Like, what is it at its core?
So DSCR, it's really just a simple way to measure whether a property can cover its debt payments with the income it generates. Like, think of it this way. Does the property make enough money to pay its bills?
Yeah.
That's basically it.
Yeah.
And the formula is really straightforward. DSCR equals net operating income, or NOI, divided by the total debt service.
Gotcha. So let's break down those two parts. What is NOI?
Okay, so net operating income, or NOI, is essentially the property's revenue after all the, typical operating expenses have been paid, but before any loan payments.
Okay.
So it's the pure income from running the property.
All right.
Yeah.
How do we calculate it?
So you start with your gross income,
Okay.
which is all the money the property brings in. So that's rent plus anything extra, like parking fees or amenity fees.
Yeah.
Then you subtract the vacancy loss, to account for any units that are empty. And then you subtract all the operating expenses.
Okay.
And those are things like managing the property, maintenance and repairs, property taxes, insurance, utilities, all the recurring costs of running the building.
Okay, cool. So Cara Conde gives us a nice example in the guide to illustrate this. So we've got a 10-unit apartment building.
Okay.
It generates $350,000 a year in rent, plus another $10,000 from other sources. So like laundry, parking, whatever.
Right.
That gives us a total gross income of $360,000.
Okay.
Now let's say we have a 5% vacancy loss that comes out to $17,500.
Right.
Then we have our operating expenses.
Okay.
$25,000 for property management, $15,000 for maintenance, $20,000 for utilities, $30,000 in property taxes,
Right.
and $12,000 for insurance.
Okay.
So those expenses total $102,000.
Right. So to find the NOI for this apartment building, you take that $360,000 gross income, subtract the $17,500 vacancy loss,
Right.
and then subtract the $102,000 in operating expenses. And that gives us an NOI of $240,500.
Okay.
And as Cara Conde points out, this number really represents the property's earnings, before any debt payments are taken out.
Yeah, like it's the pure profit the property is making before you have to worry about paying down the loans.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So then the other piece of this puzzle is total debt service. What exactly does that include?
Well, total debt service, it's just the total amount of money you need to pay each year to service all the loans on the property.
Okay.
It includes both the principal, which is the actual amount borrowed, and the interest, which is the cost of borrowing that money.
Okay.
So if a property has multiple loans, you just add up all the annual payments.
Makes sense. So in our example, we've got 2 loans on this apartment building.
Right.
There's a $2 million primary mortgage, and that has annual payments of $136,800.
Okay.
And then there's a secondary loan with annual payments of $31,800. So the total debt service is those two added together. $136,800 plus $31,800, which equals $168,600.
Exactly. So now we have both our key numbers. The NOI for the property is $240,500, and the total debt service is $168,600.
Okay.
So to calculate the DSCR, we divide 240,500 by 168,600, and that gives us a DSCR of 1.43.
Okay, so we get the number 1.43, but what does that really tell us about the property?
Well, it means that for every dollar of debt the property has to pay, it generates $1.43 in net operating income. So there's like a buffer of 43 cents on every dollar of debt after the payments are made.
Okay.
Now, generally speaking, a DSCR greater than 1 is a good sign.
Oh.
It means the property is making enough money to cover its loan payments. Whereas a DSCR below 1, that would indicate that the property is not generating enough income to cover its debt.
So it's kind of a red flag.
Yeah, exactly. And Cara Conde also, makes a great point that what's considered an acceptable DSCR, that can really vary depending on the type of commercial property you're looking at.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So a stable apartment complex, versus, say, a hotel with seasonal income, those might have very different DSCR expectations.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like a hotel might have amazing months in the summer, but then be really slow in the winter.
Exactly. And within a dynamic market like Indianapolis, where Cara Conde has tons of experience, DSCR acts like a, financial report card for a property.
Yeah.
It allows investors and lenders to quickly evaluate, how healthy it is financially.
Okay, cool. So we've defined DSCR and we walked through a basic calculation.
Right.
Now let's get into, actually calculating DSCR rigorously.
Yeah.
We've got that straightforward calculation for our apartment building.
Yeah.
And that got us a DSCR of 1.43.
Yeah. And remember, for a, relatively stable apartment building, that 1.43 DSCR, it's generally seen as a good thing by lenders. It's that comfortable safety margin.
Yeah, definitely. But Cara Conde's guide also presents another scenario.
Okay.
It's property B, a retail strip mall with that kind of seasonal income we were talking about.
Right.
So let's crunch those numbers. This property has an NOI of $180,000.
You're right.
And its total annual debt service is $200,000.
Okay, so if we divide that NOI of $180,000 by the $200,000 debt service, we get a DSCR of 0.9. And Cara Conde emphasizes, this is a major red flag.
Yeah.
A DSCR under 1 means the property isn't generating enough income to cover those debt payments.
Right.
So in this case, the property is actually short $20,000 a year.
Yeah, that's definitely not a good situation to be in.
No, not at all.
So Cara Conde walks us through some more complex aspects that can really impact DSCR calculations too.
Right.
So let's start with balloon payments. What's the big takeaway there for an investor?
You got to be really careful about how, a really good DSCR can sometimes hide some potential problems with the loan structure.
Okay.
So, for example, a loan might have smaller interest-only payments at the beginning.
Okay.
Which makes the DSCR look amazing.
Right.
But then you've got this huge balloon payment due later where the entire remaining loan principal comes due all at once.
Oh, wow.
And that can totally change the long-term picture. So Cara Conde gives us an example. Let's say you have a $50,000 interest-only payment on a property with an NOI of $150,000.
Okay.
That gives you a DSCR of 3.0, which looks fantastic.
Yeah.
But if you have a $1 million balloon payment later on, the average DSCR over the life of the loan could drop to 1.2.
Wow, so that's a big difference.
Huge. So the takeaway is don't just focus on the initial DSCR. You have to really dig into the loan terms and especially look out for any balloon payments.
That's really good advice. And then there are also interest-only loans where the initial DSCR can be a little misleading. Why is that?
Yeah, so with interest-only loans, you're only paying the interest on the loan for a set period, not the principal.
Okay.
So that means your debt service payments are lower at the beginning, which makes your DSCR higher.
Gotcha.
So in Cara Conde's example, they use a $1.5 million loan at a 5% interest rate.
Okay.
which means the annual interest payment is $75,000.
Oh, okay.
Now, if the property has an NOI of $150,000, the DSCR looks great at 2.0.
Yeah.
But once that interest-only period ends and you have to start paying down the principal, the total annual debt service goes up.
Right.
And in their example, it jumps to $120,000, which brings the DSCR down to 1.25.
Okay.
So yeah, interest-only periods can make that DSCR look really good for a while, but you got to remember it's temporary.
Yeah, you can't just look at the initial number and think you're golden.
Exactly. You got to look at what the DSCR will be once you start paying down the principal.
Okay. Now, what about properties with fluctuating income? Like that seasonal retail example we talked about, or a hotel. How do you analyze DSCR for those?
That's a really good question. And it brings up an important point about using the average NOI.
Okay.
So for properties with really variable income, like let's say a hotel that makes $300,000 in the summer, but only $100,000 in the winter, you can't just rely on the average annual NOI.
Okay.
Which in this case would be $200,000.
Right.
Because that doesn't really capture the whole picture.
Yeah.
You got to look at the DSCR during those slow periods.
Okay.
So if that hotel has an annual debt service of $150,000, the DSCR looks awesome during the summer at 2.0.
Yeah.
But in the winter, it plummets to 0.67.
Oh, wow.
Which means they're not making enough to cover the debt.
Yeah.
So Cara Conde's advice is, plan for those lean times. Make sure the property can still pay its bills, even when income is at its lowest.
Yeah, because it's not just about doing well on average. You have to make sure you can handle the bad times, too.
Exactly.
And Cara Conde also talks about looking at DSCR with a what-if lens.
Right.
Especially in a market like Indianapolis. What kind of scenarios does she have in mind there?
Well, she specifically mentions thinking about, what if rental income goes down?
Okay.
Or what if some tenants default on their leases in Indianapolis?
Yeah.
By doing these kind of stress tests on the DSCR under tougher conditions, investors and lenders can get a more realistic picture of the property's resilience. Can it weather a storm?
So it's like a worst-case scenario analysis.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've really dug into the calculation. Now let's shift gears and talk about interpreting DSCR. What do those numbers actually tell us about a property's financial health?
Right, because it's more than just being above or below one.
Yeah, exactly.
The actual DSCR number gives you a lot of insight into the property's stability and risk. So Cara Conde breaks it down into ranges. Like we saw before, a DSCR below 1.0, like that seasonal retail property at 0.9, that means the property is operating at a loss.
Right.
For every dollar of debt, it's making less than $1 in income. So there's a cash flow shortfall every year.
Yeah, which means you're going to have to dip in your own pocket to cover those costs.
Exactly.
Not ideal.
Yeah.
What about a DSCR that's just barely above 1? Like in that 1.0 to 1.19 range.
Cara Conde calls that barely scraping by. So let's say you have a DSCR of 1.1.
Okay.
That means there's a tiny margin of income after debt payments. But like even a small unexpected expense, like a repair, could wipe that out and put the property in the red.
Right.
There's no wiggle room.
Okay, so that also sounds pretty risky. So where does the DSCR need to be to give you that kind of comfortable financial security?
According to Cara Conde, that sweet spot is between 1.20 and 1.49.
Okay.
So a DSCR of 1.3, for example, provides a much bigger buffer. It can handle unexpected costs or, a dip in income. And a lot of banks and lenders like to see a DSCR of at least 1.25.
Gotcha. So they see that as a safer bet.
Exactly.
Now, we've talked about higher being better, but what about a DSCR of 1.5? Oh, more.
Yeah, so while a really high DSCR like 1.7, that definitely shows a strong financial position, with plenty of income after covering debt payments.
Right.
Cara Conde makes an interesting point.
Okay.
She says a super high DSCR could actually mean the investor isn't using enough leverage.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, it's super safe, but their money might not be working as hard as it could be.
Okay.
And that could limit their returns and growth potential. So there's a balance to strike. More isn't always better.
Yeah, it's like you're playing it too safe and missing out on potential gains.
Right.
So we've talked about these general ranges, but Cara Conde mentions that the required DSCR can really vary a lot. What are the biggest factors that cause that variation?
There are a few key things that influence DSCR requirements. First, different lenders have different appetites for risk.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So a more conservative lender might require a higher DSCR, like 1.35 for an office building in Indianapolis.
Okay.
But a lender who's more comfortable with risk might be okay with a lower DSCR, like 1.2 for an apartment complex.
Gotcha.
It really depends on how the lender views the property, the borrower's creditworthiness, and the overall market.
Makes sense. So lender comfort levels are definitely a big factor.
Yeah.
What's another key thing that affects DSCR expectations?
Your own investment goals and strategies.
Okay.
So if you're looking for like steady income with minimal risk, you might aim for a higher DSCR, like around 1.5 or even higher.
Okay.
But if you're going for a value add strategy where you plan to improve the property and raise rents, you might be okay with a lower initial DSCR, like around 1.1.
Right.
Because you expect the DSCR to go up as you make those improvements and increase the income.
So it's a balancing act between security and growth potential.
Exactly.
And Cara brings it back to the Indianapolis market and points out that even within the city, DSCR expectations can be different depending on the type of property and where it's located.
Right.
What's an example of that?
So for a retail property downtown, which might be more vulnerable to changes in foot traffic and tenant turnover, you'd probably want a higher DSCR to give you that extra financial cushion. But for a suburban warehouse with stable long-term leases, a lower DSCR might be acceptable.
Right, because the income's more predictable.
Exactly. So you got to adjust your DSCR expectations based on the specific property and its location within Indianapolis.
So location, location, location.
Always.
All right, so we've got a good grasp on what DSCR is and how to interpret it. Now let's talk about how it actually plays out in the real world of commercial real estate.
Yeah.
Sounds like it's a major factor in a lot of different stages.
Absolutely. DSCR is key from getting financing to managing the property and even selling it down the line.
Wow, so it's with you the whole way.
Pretty much. Let's start with the lender's perspective.
Okay, so how does DSCR influence the kind of loan terms a lender is willing to offer?
A property's DSCR directly impacts the financing it can get. Conde gives a good example. A property with a solid DSCR of 1.4 might qualify for a loan that covers 80% of its value.
Okay.
That's a lower loan-to-value ratio, or LTV.
Gotcha.
And they might get a good interest rate, like 4.25%, but a property with a weaker DSCR of 1.1 might only get a loan for 60% of its value.
Okay.
Which is a higher LTV for the borrower, more risk for the lender.
Wait.
And they'll probably have to pay a higher interest rate, like 5.75%.
Oh, wow.
So the point is, a stronger DSCR usually means better loan terms.
Yeah, so not only does a good DSCR make you more likely to get approved for a loan, but it can also save you a ton of money over time with lower interest payments.
Exactly. And a lot of commercial real estate loan agreements also have these things called financial covenants, which basically require the borrower to maintain a minimum DSCR throughout the loan.
Gotcha.
So, for example, the agreement might say that the DSCR can't fall below 1.3. If it does, that's a breach of the agreement, and the lender could foreclose.
Oh, wow. So it's not just about getting the loan, it's about staying on top of it.
Exactly. So borrowers need to keep a close eye on their DSCR.
Okay. Now, what about from the investor's point of view? How does DSCR play into their investment strategy?
For investors, DSCR is essential for evaluating potential properties.
Right.
So Conde compares two different scenarios.
Okay.
You could have a low-risk opportunity, like a $3 million strip mall, with a strong DSCR of 1.6.
Okay.
That offers stability and predictable cash flow, but the returns might not be huge.
Okay.
On the other hand, you could have a higher risk, higher reward property, like a $2 million building with a DSCR of only 0.95.
Okay.
That's a fixer-upper.
Right.
But if you can make the right improvements and boost the income, you could see big returns.
So it's all about weighing your risk tolerance and your desired returns.
Exactly. And DSCR helps you make those decisions.
And it's not just relevant when you're buying a property, right? It's also important for managing a property you already own.
Absolutely. So if your DSCR is improving, that could be a good time to think about refinancing.
Okay.
You might be able to get a lower interest rate and reduce your monthly payments, which would increase your cash flow.
Right.
But if your DSCR is going down, especially if you're worried about tenants leaving or expenses going up, you might want to consider selling the property.
Okay.
Before things get worse.
That makes sense. And then, of course, there are external market forces that can have a big impact, too.
Right.
How do things like rising interest rates affect a property's DSCR?
Market changes like interest rate hikes can really hurt a property's DSCR.
Yeah.
So Cara Conde gives an example where interest rates go up in 2025 and a property's annual debt payments increase by $30,000.
Oh, wow.
If the NOI stays the same, that higher debt service is going to directly lower the DSCR maybe from 1.5 to 1.25.
Okay.
But she also points out that in Indianapolis, rents are going up.
Right.
Like they've seen an 8% increase for apartments.
Mhm.
So that can actually help offset the negative impact of higher interest rates.
Because the property's income is also increasing.
Exactly. So it's a constant push and pull between income expenses and debt costs.
Right. It's like a balancing act.
Yeah.
Cara Conde also shares a really interesting case study from her work in Indianapolis.
Oh, yeah. This is a great one.
Can you walk us through it?
So she had a client who wanted to buy a $4 million warehouse in Indianapolis.
Okay.
It had an NOI of $360,000 and an annual debt service of $300,000.
So that's a DSCR of 1.2.
Exactly. But lenders weren't really keen on financing the deal because the margin was so tight.
Yeah, I can see why they'd be hesitant.
Right. So Cara Conde steps in and uses her expertise to improve that DSCR.
Okay, how did she do that?
Well, she negotiated a $20,000 rent increase with a potential tenant.
Nice.
And she found ways to cut the utility costs by $10,000 a year through some energy efficiency upgrades.
Okay.
So now the property's NOI is $390,000.
Wow.
The debt service stayed at $300,000. So the DSCR jumped to a much healthier 1.3.
And did they get the loan?
They did, and the client was thrilled. So it just goes to show you how understanding and actively managing DSCR can make all the difference in real estate deals.
Absolutely. It's a great example of how knowing your numbers can pay off.
Yeah.
So let's get into the specifics of optimizing DSCR. What are some things investors can do to improve their DSCR?
So you basically have two options, right? Increase your net operating income or decrease your total debt service.
Okay, so let's start with boosting NOI.
All right, so to increase NOI, investors can focus on generating more income from the property.
Okay.
Cara Conde suggests things like raising rents to match market rates. Even small rent increases across a bunch of units can add up to a lot of money.
Right.
Or finding new income streams,
Okay.
like putting up a billboard on the property and renting out that space.
Yeah, that's smart.
She says small wins add up.
Absolutely. And then, of course, you have to manage your expenses.
Right. So the other side of boosting NOI is lowering those operating costs.
Okay.
So things like switching to LED lighting to save on electricity
Yeah.
or negotiating better property management fees. Even a small percentage decrease can save you a lot of money.
Okay, so those are some good ways to improve the income and control the expenses that impact NOI.
Yeah.
What about managing the debt service?
So one good strategy is to look into refinancing your loan,
Okay.
especially if interest rates have gone down since you got the original loan or if your property is doing much better financially.
Right.
You might be able to snag a lower interest rate, which means lower monthly payments and a higher DSCR.
That makes sense.
Cara Conde has an example where refinancing a $2 million loan from 5.5% down to 4% made a big difference for the property's DSCR.
Cool.
Another option is to extend the loan term.
Okay.
So yeah, you'll be paying interest for longer, but your annual payments will be lower, which will boost your DSCR.
Okay.
And Cara Conde also talks about what she calls property tricks, which can indirectly improve DSCR.
Okay. What are those?
So these are things like actually making improvements to the property or being strategic about your tenants.
Okay.
The goal is to increase the property's income potential.
Right.
So, for example, renovating kitchens and bathrooms might allow you to charge higher rent.
Makes sense.
Or replacing a low-paying tenant with one who's willing to pay more can also boost your income.
Right. So it all comes back to either increasing that NOI or decreasing that debt service.
Exactly. And Cara Conde has another great example from Indianapolis.
Okay. What is it?
This time it's an office building that had a really low DSCR of just 1.05. But Cara Conde managed to turn it around and get the DSCR up to 1.35.
Okay. How?
Well, she added a rooftop event space, which brought in a bunch of new income.
Smart.
And she also refinanced the loan to lower the annual debt service.
Nice.
So those two things combined made a huge difference for the property's financial performance.
So again, it's about being proactive and knowing how to work the system.
Right.
Okay, so to wrap things up, Cara Conde's guide has this People Also Ask section.
Yeah, it's super helpful.
Let's go through a few of those common questions.
Okay.
One that comes up a lot is the difference between DSCR and loan-to-value, or LTV.
Right, a lot of people get those confused.
Can you clear that up?
So Cara Conde has a good way of putting it. She says, DSCR is about paying, LTV is about borrowing.
Okay.
DSCRs, we've talked about, looks at the relationship between a property's income and its debt.
Right.
Can it pay its bills?
Yeah.
LTV, on the other hand, compares the loan amount to the property's value. So let's say you have a $2 million loan on a property worth $3 million.
Okay.
That's an LTV of 66%.
Gotcha.
So DSCR is about cash flow covering the debt, and LTV is about the size of the loan compared to the property's value.
That's a really clear explanation.
Yeah.
Another common question is about the impact of rising interest rates on DSCR. We touched on this earlier, but can you give us the key takeaway?
The main thing to remember is that when interest rates go up, the cost of borrowing money goes up too.
Right.
Which means higher debt payments, especially for variable rate loans or when you refinance.
Okay.
If the NOI stays the same, that increase in debt service is going to lower the DSCR.
Right.
Cara Conde puts it like this: rates up, DSCR down, unless income grows.
Yeah.
So investors really need to consider potential interest rate changes when they're evaluating a property.
It's all about the long game.
Exactly.
Okay, here's an interesting one.
Okay.
Can you get a loan for a property with a DSCR below 1?
So it's not ideal, but Cara Conde says, yes, there are financing options, sometimes called DSCR loans, for properties with a DSCR below 1,
Okay.
even as low as 0.9. But those loans come with much higher interest rates,
Yeah.
like 7% or more, because the lender is taking on more risk.
Yeah.
And you'll usually need a much bigger down payment, too.
So it's a riskier move.
Definitely. Cara Conde helps some investors in Indianapolis who are comfortable with higher risk to find these types of loans.
Okay. And what about stress-tested DSCR? What is that?
Stress testing a DSCR is basically calculating it under some bad conditions
Okay.
to see how tough the property is.
So it's like a financial pressure test.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So Cara Conde gives an example of imagining a big increase in the vacancy rate, like 15%,
Okay.
which would really lower the NOI.
Right.
By calculating the DSCR with that lower income, you can see if the property can still handle its debt payments.
Gotcha.
It's a way to see how much of a safety net you have.
That's a really smart way to look at risk. So finally, Cara Conde obviously has a ton of experience in the Indianapolis market. How does she actually use DSCR in her work?
Cara Conde has a really strategic approach.
Okay.
So for clients who want safe and steady investments in Indianapolis, she usually aims for a DSCR of 1.6 or higher
Okay.
to provide a cushion against market ups and downs. But for properties that have a lot of potential for growth, through renovations or repositioning in the market, she might be okay with a lower initial DSCR around 1.1.
Okay.
She uses her deep knowledge of Indianapolis rents in different areas of the market to see if those growth projections are realistic.
So it's about being flexible and knowing your market.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's clear that DSCR is more than just a simple ratio.
Oh, absolutely. It's like